Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive where we pick a topic and, we really try to unpack it in a way that's clear and useful for you.
Yeah, we want to make sure you really get a solid understanding.
Exactly. And today, we're tackling something that's pretty important for anyone aiming for those master's programs, English reading comprehension for those entrance exams.
Right, because those exams, they can be pretty tough.
Yeah, they really can be. And to help us, break it down, we're going to be focusing on a specific text. It's called Text 10.
And Text10 is one of those passages that often pops up on those exams.
Yeah, it's like a classic, so if you're prepping for those master's exams, chances are you might bump into this one.
So we want to make sure you're well prepared.
Exactly. And instead of, getting all academic and jargony, we want to break this text down in a way that's really clear and simple.
We want you to build that strong foundation.
Yeah, so you can tackle any reading passage they throw at you. And just to give you a heads up, Text 10 is this article all about IQ tests. Those tests that try to measure intelligence.
Yeah, most of us have probably come across those at some point.
Right. And it all starts with this column called Ask Marilyn. Have you ever heard of that one?
Oh, yeah, Ask Marilyn. It was pretty popular.
Yeah. And it featured this incredible person, Marilyn Vos Savant. She had this exceptionally high IQ score, like way off the charts.
Really high.
Yeah. It was the highest ever recorded.
Wow.
So what we're going to do today is really dive into Text 10. We'll explore the main ideas, take a close look at how those sentences are structured, kind of like, taking apart a clock to see how all the gears work.
Right, dissecting it.
Yep, we'll break down some key vocabulary and even get you started on thinking about those tricky comprehension questions that always seem to follow these readings.
So you'll be ready to tackle those questions.
Right, so let's kick things off by getting a sense of the big picture. What's this text all about?
Okay, so Text 10, it starts with this really interesting example. It uses that Ask Marilyn column and introduces us to Marilyn Vos Savant.
Right, she's the one with the super high IQ.
Exactly, and the text mentions that she's answering these philosophical questions. Like, what's the difference between love and fondness? Or what's the nature of luck and coincidence?
Wow, those are some pretty deep questions.
Yeah, and, it's interesting because based on her high IQ, you'd think she'd be amazing at things like, pattern recognition or solving complex puzzles. But these questions, they're about abstract concepts, emotions.
Yeah, it's not like she's cracking codes or something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, like, how does being good at those other skills translate to answering these kinds of questions?
Right. It's like being a fantastic chef and then being asked to write a symphony about food. Like the skills seem kind of different.
Yeah, it's a bit of a puzzle.
It is. And that's what makes this intro so intriguing. It sets up this central question that the text wants us to consider. What does it really mean to be smart?
Right. Is it just about having a high IQ score?
Or is there more to it?
Exactly. And the text goes on to explore different perspectives on intelligence.
So it's not just about Marilyn Vos Savant's IQ.
Right. It's a broader discussion.
Gotcha. So the article starts with this specific example, this puzzle about Marilyn Vos Savant answering philosophical questions, and then it expands to look at intelligence more broadly.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So now that we've got a sense of the overall picture, let's zoom in and get into the nitty-gritty of the language. How are those sentences put together? What are the words doing?
Let's break it down.
Exactly. And we'll start with the very first paragraph, the foundation of it all. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so the first sentence is, for the past several years, the Sunday newspaper supplement parade has featured a column called Ask Marilyn. Now, this sentence, it might seem a bit long, but we can untangle it if we look for the main parts.
Yeah, like finding the key pieces of a puzzle.
Exactly. So who or what is doing the action in this sentence?
Okay, so in this sentence, the main actor, the subject is parade.
Parade, like the publication.
Right, the Sunday newspaper supplement.
Got it. And what action is parade doing?
The main verb is has featured. That's the action parade has been doing.
Okay, so parade has been featuring something. So what is it featuring?
It's been featuring a column. That's the object of the action.
Okay, and that column has a specific name, right?
Exactly. It's called Ask Marilyn.
All right, so we have the main parts parade has featured and a column called Ask Marilyn, and then we have these extra bits of information that kind of add detail.
Yeah, they give us more context.
Right. So for the past several years, that tells us when this has been happening. Like it sets the time frame.
Right. And the Sunday newspaper supplement, that tells us what kind of publication parade is.
So it's like saying, for a while now, that blue car has been carrying a passenger named John.
I like that analogy.
Right. So blue car is like Sunday newspaper supplement parade has been carrying, is like has featured, and a passenger named John is like a column called Ask Marilyn.
Makes sense.
Cool. So we've tackled the first sentence. Now on to the second one. This one's a bit longer, but we can handle it. It says, people are invited to query Marilyn Vos-Savant, who at age 10 had tested at a mental level of someone about 23 years old that gave her an IQ of 228, the highest score ever recorded. Deep breath.
We can do this.
Right. Let's break it down into chunks. The first part is people are invited to query Marilyn Vos-Savant. So who are the main players here?
Right, so in this part, the subject is people, and the verb is are invited.
Are invited. Okay, so people are being invited to do something. What is it?
They're being invited to query Marilyn Vos-Savant. That's the purpose of the invitation.
And query, does that just mean ask?
Yep, it's a fancier way of saying ask. So people are being invited to ask Marilyn Vos-Savant questions.
Okay, and then we have a comma followed by who at age 10 had tested at a mental level of someone about 23 years old. What's going on with this part?
All right, so this is what we call a relative clause. It starts with who, and it's giving us extra information about Marilyn Vos-Savant.
So it's like a little detour to tell us more about her.
Exactly, and at age 10 tells us when this testing happened.
Okay, and then it says had tested. Is there something special about that verb tense?
Yes, had tested is in the past perfect tense, which means this testing happened before another past event, in this case before she started the column.
Ah, so it's like saying, my friend John, who is really tall, plays basketball well.
Perfect example.
Yep.
So who was really tall? That's the relative clause giving you bonus info about John.
Right, so it's like we're saying Marilyn Vos-Savant, and by the way, when she was 10, she was already thinking like someone much older.
Exactly.
And then we have a semicolon. That's like a heavy-duty comma, right?
Yeah, it often connects two closely related ideas.
Gotcha. So the next part is, that gave her an IQ of 228. What's that referring back to?
Okay, so that refers back to the whole idea of her testing at a mental level of a 23-year-old when she was just 10. That's what led to her getting that impressive IQ score.
And that score was?
228.
Wow. And then we have a dash followed by the highest score ever recorded. What's that part doing?
That's called an appositive. It's like giving a nickname or adding more detail to the IQ of 228.
So it's not just any IQ score, it's the most impressive one ever.
Exactly. It's like saying, my dog, a golden retriever, loves to play fetch.
Right. A golden retriever, that's the appositive, giving you more info about the dog.
You got it.
Cool. See, breaking it down makes it so much clearer. All right, on to sentence number 3. IQ tests ask you to complete verbal and visual analogies to envision paper after it has been folded and cut, and to deduce numerical sequences among other similar tasks. Okay, what's the main action happening here?
The main action is ask. And who's doing the asking?
IQ tests, right?
Right. IQ tests are the subject of the sentence, and they ask.
And who are they asking?
They're asking you, the person taking the test. So, that includes our listeners, too.
Right, so it's like the tests are talking directly to you.
Exactly. IQ tests ask you.
Okay, and what do they ask you to do?
Well, we have a series of things they ask you to do. They're called infinitive phrases.
Infinitive phrases? Those sound kind of technical.
Well, they do, but they're pretty simple. It's just to plus a verb. So here we have to complete verbal and visual analogies, to envision paper after it has been folded and cut, and to deduce numerical sequences. These are all examples of what IQ tests might ask you to do.
Okay, so it's like a teacher saying, I ask you to do your homework to read the chapter and to answer the questions.
Exactly. To do, to read, to answer. Those are the infinitive phrases telling you what the teacher wants you to do.
Got it. So the sentence is like saying IQ tests ask you to do these things, and then it gives you some examples.
Right.
Okay, and we have that phrase after it has been folded and cut. That seems a bit complicated.
Yeah, it looks a bit tricky, but it's just a shortened version of a longer phrase. The full version could be after paper has been folded and cut, but they trimmed it down to make the sentence flow better.
Makes sense. So it's all about being concise.
Exactly. And by the way, envision. That means to create a picture in your mind, to imagine something.
Like closing your eyes and picturing a shape.
That's it. And deduce means to figure something out using logic and reasoning, like a detective solving a mystery.
Okay, so it's all about using your brain power. And at the end, we have, among other similar tasks. What does that tell us?
That tells us that these are just a few examples. There are lots of other things an IQ test might ask you to do.
So it's not an exhaustive list.
Right.
Okay, on to sentence number 4. This one says, so it is a bit confusing when Vos-Savant fields such queries from the average Joe whose IQ is 100 as, what's the difference between love and fondness? Or what is the nature of luck and coincidence that it is? When structure can be a bit tricky sometimes.
Yeah, it can be, but we can break it down. The word so is like a bridge connecting this sentence to the previous one.
Okay, so it's showing us there's a connection between the ideas.
Exactly. And then we have that it is a bit confusing when structure.
Hmm.
In this case, it is just a placeholder subject. The real subject comes after when.
So what's the real subject?
The real subject is vos savant fields such queries, that whole chunk.
Field such queries, what does that mean exactly?
Field such queries means she answers or deals with these kinds of questions. Think of a baseball player fielding a ball. They catch it and handle it.
Ah, so she's catching and handling these questions.
Right.
Okay, and who is she getting these questions from?
She's getting them from the average Joe.
Yeah.
It's a casual way of saying an ordinary person.
Right, like someone you might meet on the street.
Exactly. And then we have whose IQ is 100 in parentheses. What's that part doing?
It's giving us extra info about the average Joe, right? It's telling us their approximate IQ score.
Exactly. It's another relative clause giving us more details.
So it's like saying, my neighbor who loves to garden just planted some tomatoes.
Perfect example. The who loves to garden gives you extra info about the neighbor.
Right. And finally, we have as. What's the difference between love and fondness, or what is the nature of luck and coincidence? What's the as doing there?
The as is introducing examples of the queries she receives.
So these are the kinds of questions the average Joe is asking her.
Yeah, and nature in this context means the basic characteristics or the essence of something.
So asking about the nature of luck is like asking what luck really is at its core.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm following. So sentence 4 is saying, it's a bit strange that Marilyn Vos Savant, who's supposedly super good at visual and numerical tasks, is spending her time answering these deep philosophical questions from regular folks.
That's a good summary.
Now for the last sentence of this paragraph. It's not obvious how the capacity to visualize objects and to figure out numerical patterns suits one to answer questions that have eluded some of the best poets and philosophers. View another long one.
It is, but don't worry, we'll break it down.
Okay, so it starts with it's not obvious. What does that tell us?
It means it's not easy to understand or see the connection right away.
Right. There's a bit of a mystery here. And what's the mystery?
The mystery is the how clause that follows how the capacity to visualize objects and to figure out numerical patterns suits one to answer questions.
Okay, that's a mouthful. What does suits one to answer mean?
It means makes someone capable or well prepared to answer those questions. So the sentence is wondering how those skills, visualizing and figuring out patterns, make someone good at answering those kinds of questions.
And what kinds of questions are we talking about?
We're talking about questions that have eluded some of the best poets and philosophers.
What does eluded mean?
Eluded means avoided understanding by or escaped the grasp of.
So these are tough questions that even really smart people have struggled with.
Exactly.
So the paragraph ends by highlighting this disconnect. It's like saying, hey, it's not clear how being a whiz with puzzles means you can answer these deep questions that have puzzled some of history's greatest thinkers.
Yeah, it sets up this tension between different ways of thinking about intelligence.
Right, because we often associate IQ tests with a certain type of intelligence, but maybe there's more to the story.
Exactly. And that's what the rest of the text will explore.
Okay, awesome. So we've unpacked the first paragraph sentence by sentence. Now let's focus on some key vocabulary from this section. We've already touched on a few words, but let's make sure we really understand them.
Right, let's solidify our understanding.
Okay, so we encountered the word query, which just means question or ask, right?
Exactly, it's a more formal synonym.
And mental level, what does that refer to?
Mental level refers to your cognitive ability compared to other people in your age group.
So it's like saying this 10-year-old has the mental level of a 15-year-old.
Yeah. Exactly. Their thinking skills are more advanced than average for their age.
Got it. And of course we have IQ, which stands for...
Intelligence quotient.
Right. And it's a score that tries to measure intelligence, although, as we've been discussing the text questions, whether that's the whole story.
Yeah, it's just one piece of the puzzle.
So we have the word analogy. How would you explain that to someone who's never heard it before?
Okay, so an analogy is all about finding a relationship between two things and then finding another pair of things that has the same relationship.
Okay, I think I get it. Can you give us an example?
Sure. So think of it this way. Hot is to cold is up is to down.
Okay. So the relationship between hot and cold is the same as the relationship between up and down.
Exactly. They're opposites.
And what about envision?
Envision means to imagine or picture something in your mind.
Like trying to visualize what a 3D shape looks like from different angles.
Exactly. It's about creating a mental image.
Cool. And how about deduce?
Deduce means to figure something out using logic and reasoning. It's like being a detective and piecing together clues to solve a case.
Okay, so it's not just guessing, it's about thinking things through.
Right. Using the information you have to arrive at a conclusion.
Awesome. We also talked about fields in the context of fields, such queries. What did that mean?
In that case, fields means answers or deals with. So she's fielding those questions like a pro.
Like a shortstop fielding a ground ball.
Right. She's handling those questions smoothly.
Got it. And then there's average Joe, which is just a slang term for
An ordinary person.
someone you might bump into at the grocery store.
Exactly.
And we encountered nature in the phrase nature of luck and coincidence. What does nature mean in this context?
In this case, nature refers to the basic characteristics or the essence of something. So when they talk about the nature of luck, they're asking what luck really is at its core.
Deep stuff. And last but not least, we had eluded, which means...
Eluded means that something has escaped understanding or has been difficult to grasp.
like a slippery bar of soap.
Yeah. Or a concept that just won't stick in your mind.
Okay, great. So we've covered some important vocab. Now let's shift gears and think about the challenges that someone might face when reading this first paragraph, especially if English isn't their first language.
Right, because even for native speakers, this passage can be a bit dense.
Yeah, it's got those long sentences with multiple parts.
Exactly. And those long sentences, they could feel overwhelming, like trying to climb a mountain.
Yeah, they can make you feel lost in a sea of words.
Right. But the key is to break them down into smaller pieces.
Chunk it up.
Exactly. Like eating a pizza one slice at a time.
Pizza. Okay, so first things first, identify the main subject and the main verb, who's doing what.
Right. Find the core of the sentence.
And then look for those extra phrases or clauses that add details.
Don't try to swallow the whole thing at once.
Take it bite by bite.
Exactly.
And what about those relative clauses? You know, the parts that start with who, that, or which. Those can trip people up sometimes.
They can. Those relative clauses, they're like mini sentences embedded within a larger sentence.
Like those Russian nesting dolls.
Yeah, exactly. And they give us extra information about a noun.
So they act like adjectives.
Precisely. They're describing something.
Okay, so if you can figure out what noun the relative clause is describing, that helps you understand the whole sentence better.
Right. It's all about making connections.
And sometimes we bump into words that have slightly different meanings depending on how they're used in the sentence.
That's the tricky thing about English words, can be quite flexible.
Right, so it's not enough to just memorize a definition. You have to see how the word's behaving in that specific sentence.
Exactly. Context is key.
And look for clues like synonyms or other words nearby that might give you a hint about the meaning.
Yeah. Those contextual clues are super helpful.
Great. So to recap those key strategies for tackling difficult sentences, break them down, figure out what those relative clauses are telling you, and pay attention to how words are used in context.
Those are the building blocks.
Awesome advice. Now let's try applying these strategies to a basic comprehension question that often comes with text 10. So the first question typically asks, which of the following may be required in an intelligence test? And then you're given 4 options to choose from.
All right, so let's go back to the text and see if we can find the answer.
Exactly. Let's head back to paragraph 1, specifically sentence 3, because that's where the text gives us examples of what IQ tests might include.
Right, sentence 3, it's our guide.
Okay, so sentence 3 says, IQ tests ask you to complete verbal and visual analogies, to envision paper after it has been folded and cut, and to deduce numerical sequences among other similar tasks. Now let's look at those options. The first option A is answering philosophical questions. Did sentence 3 mention anything about philosophy?
Not really.
Nope. It actually contrasted those philosophical questions Marilyn Vos Savant answers with the typical tasks found in IQ tests.
Right, so A is probably not the answer we're looking for.
Okay, what about option B, folding or cutting paper into different shapes?
Well, the sentence mentions to envision paper after it has been folded and cut.
Right, but envision means to imagine it in your mind, not actually physically fold and cut the paper.
Good point. So while it's about spatial reasoning, the focus is on the mental task, not the physical action.
Okay, so B might be partially related, but it's not a perfect match.
Right. It's not as direct as we'd like.
Let's move on to option C, telling the differences between certain concepts.
Now that sounds a bit like the Ask Marilyn questions.
Yeah, those questions were all about comparing and contrasting concepts.
Yeah.
But does sentence 3 specifically say that explaining those differences is a required part of a standard IQ test?
Not in those exact words.
Right. But it does mention verbal analogies.
Yeah, and remember our hot is to cold is up is to down example.
Right? Solving analogies often requires you to understand the relationships and differences between concepts.
So C could be connected, but it's not stated as explicitly as analogies.
Okay, last option D is choosing words or graphs similar to the given ones.
Now that sounds promising.
It does, because sentence 3 specifically mentions verbal and visual analogies.
Right. Verbal analogies would definitely involve choosing words that have a similar relationship to other words.
And visual analogies could involve choosing graphs or patterns that match the ones you're given.
Exactly. So D seems to be the most direct connection to what the text explicitly states.
Awesome. So if we're focusing on what the text specifically says in that sentence about what IQ tests might involve, D seems like the most solid answer.
Right. It's all about finding the closest match.
And for someone who's just starting to learn these strategies, sticking to the most obvious connections is a good way to build confidence.
Definitely. It's a solid foundation.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Now, to give you a taste of what's coming up in the rest of Text 10, paragraph 2 moves beyond those specific tasks and starts talking about what intelligence really means in a broader sense.
Right. It expands the discussion.
And then paragraph 3 delves into the IQ score itself, how it's used to define intelligence, and why those super high scores like Marilyn Vos savants are less common these days.
Yeah, why you don't see those sky-high scores as much anymore.
Exactly. And it explains that the way IQ scores are calculated has changed. It's not just about mental age divided by chronological age anymore.
It's more about comparing your performance to other people in your age group.
Right, so it's become a relative measure rather than an absolute measure.
Exactly. And this paragraph also briefly mentions other standardized tests, like the SAT and the GRE.
Right, those tests that try to measure similar things but maybe in different ways.
Yeah, it broadens the scope a bit.
And then paragraph 4 brings in some criticisms of these standardized tests.
Right. It points out some potential limitations.
Yeah, it suggests that maybe they're not so good at measuring things like creativity or practical skills.
Right. And it also mentions how your test-taking abilities can influence your score.
So even if you're creative and have great practical skills, you might not do well on a standardized test if you get nervous easily or haven't had much practice with those types of questions.
It's an important consideration.
It is. So those are some of the key points that Text 10 explores.
It's a really interesting discussion about the complexities of intelligence and how we try to measure it.
And even though we've only looked at the first paragraph in detail, I think we've already uncovered some important insights and strategies.
Right. We've laid a solid foundation.
Exactly. Now let's tackle one more basic question this time, related to paragraph 3. Question 3 asks, people nowadays can no longer achieve IQ scores as high as Vos savants because... And you get 4 options to choose from.
Okay, so we need to head back to paragraph 3 and see what it says about those super high scores.
Exactly. So paragraph 3 specifically addresses why those astronomical scores, like Marilyn Vos savants, are less common now. And it states that it's because scoring is now based on a statistical population distribution among age peers, rather than simply dividing the mental age by the chronological age and multiplying by 100.
Right, so it's a different way of calculating the score.
Totally.
Okay.
Now let's look at the options. Option A says the scores are obtained through different computational procedures. Does that match what paragraph 3 is saying?
I think so.
Yeah, me too, because the text describes a shift from a simple calculation to a more complex one that involves comparing your performance to a whole group of people your age.
Right, it's not just about mental age divided by actual age anymore.
Exactly. So A seems like a strong contender.
Yeah, it aligns with what the text is saying.
Okay, what about option B? Creativity rather than analytical skills is emphasized now.
Paragraph 3 doesn't mention any changes in what IQ tests are trying to measure. It's only about how the scores are calculated.
So B is not really supported by this part of the text.
Right, it's talking about a different aspect.
Let's move on to C, which says, Vos savant's case is an extreme one that will not repeat.
Well, her score was definitely exceptional, but the paragraph is giving a reason why those super high scores are less likely now based on the scoring method, not just because her case was so rare.
Right, so it's not just about her individual situation, it's about systemic change.
Exactly.
And finally, option D says, the defining characteristic of IQ test has changed.
But the text suggests that the tests are still trying to measure similar things, just the way the score is calculated has changed.
Right, it's a change in the scoring procedure, not a change in the fundamental nature of the test.
So D isn't as strongly supported as A.
Exactly. So, based on what paragraph 3 tells us, the most likely reason why those super high IQ scores are less common now is because of the change in the scoring methods.
Right, it's all about how the numbers are crunched.
So A, the scores are obtained through different computational procedures, is the answer that aligns most closely with the text.
It's the best match.
Okay, fantastic. Now let's put on our teacher hats and think about what might be confusing for students, especially those who are still getting comfortable with English reading comprehension. What are some parts of this text that might make them scratch their heads?
I think that explanation of how IQ scores are calculated now that shift from mental age to comparing you to others in your age group, that can be a bit abstract.
Yeah, it's not something you can easily visualize.
Right, it's like trying to explain how gravity works. It's a concept, but it's hard to picture.
I see what you mean. It's not like you can point to a specific object and say, that's an IQ score.
Exactly. It's more about understanding how your performance on a test relates to the performance of others.
So maybe a good way to explain it is to use an analogy, like saying, it's like being ranked in your class based on your grades.
Yeah, that's a good one. So instead of saying you got a 90 on the test, and it's more like saying you scored higher than 80% of your classmates.
Right, it's about your position relative to others.
Exactly. And I think that concept of analogies itself might need some extra attention.
Yeah, it's a word that can be a bit slippery.
It is, and it's important to understand that it's all about finding those parallel relationships between two sets of things.
So maybe providing more examples of different types of analogies could be helpful.
Yeah, and emphasizing that it's not about the specific content, but about the relationship between the elements.
Right, so it doesn't matter if it's about cats and dogs or colors or shapes. It's about finding that pattern of connection.
Exactly. And I think another potential stumbling block is knowing when to stick to what the text explicitly states and when you might need to make a small inference.
Yes, the inference game.
That can be tricky because sometimes the answer isn't spelled out directly in the text.
Right, you have to read between the lines a bit.
But it's important to make sure your inferences are logically supported by the information that is provided.
Right, it's not about making wild guesses, it's about making educated deductions based on the evidence.
Exactly.
So those are some of the challenges that students might face when tackling this text and those comprehension questions.
But with practice and the right strategies, they can definitely overcome those hurdles.
Exactly. It's all about building those reading comprehension muscles.
Breaking down those complex sentences and concepts into manageable chunks.
Absolutely. Well, I think this has been a really productive deep dive into Text 10. We've spent a lot of time laying that groundwork, understanding the first paragraph in detail.
Yes, we've really dissected it.
We've looked at the main ideas, analyzed the sentence structures, explored key vocabulary, and even tackled a couple of those comprehension questions.
So we've covered a lot of ground.
We have. So for our listeners, I'd encourage you to go back and reread the sections we've discussed today. Pay attention to how those sentences are built and how the words are used.
Right, really soak it in.
And try to remember those vocabulary words in context.
Because context is key.
Absolutely. Now, as you're reviewing, here's something to ponder. Based on what we've learned about IQ tests from this first part of the text, do you think they're a good way to measure intelligence? Or are there other important aspects of intelligence that they might miss?
That's a great question to think about.
It is, because the text is raising some doubts about whether those standardized tests tell the whole story.
Right, they might be one piece of the puzzle, but maybe not the whole picture.
Exactly. So that's something to chew on as you continue your reading comprehension journey.
And we'll be here to guide you along the way.
Right. Join us for our next deep dive, where we'll continue exploring Text 10 and tackle those remaining paragraphs and questions.
We'll build on what we've learned today and delve even deeper.
Until then, keep reading, keep practicing, and keep those brains buzzing.
Happy studying, everyone.
See you next time.